Hello, everyone. I am going to talk to you today about blood plasma. And blood plasma is that amber colored liquid that is at the top of that test tube there. I need you to remember that blood plasma makes up about 55% of your blood volume, and that plasma is mostly water. So remember that in the blood samples, we're going to have formed elements, which we talked about those 7, the red blood cells, the white blood cells, and the platelets. And now we're going to be talking about the importance of the things that are in the plasma, because plasma is very, very important. So the first thing that you guys need to remember is that blood plasma is going to be mostly water, but then it also has proteins. So 7% is blood proteins. So we can see right here, blood proteins and then 2% nutrients. And those are going to be amino acids, which will be proteins. There's going to be hormones in there, and then electrolytes. I'm sure you're familiar with the term electrolytes. Okay, so something that you should know is that there's something called a hematocrit. That's the highlighted thing in yellow. A hematocrit is a sample that is spun in a centrifuge, and it separates the red blood cells from the white blood cells from the plasma. So they would look at your white blood cell count differently if we were doing this in a real lab versus what we did when we looked at the prepared slides. So talking about these things, I want you to remember that the blood plasma can be divided into 2 things, the plasma proteins and then other solutes. Okay, so these are going to be the non-living parts of blood, and this here is where you want to start writing. The non-living parts of blood, 92% water, and then we have albumin, which is one of those plasma proteins, and albumin is responsible for regulating osmotic pressure. So this is why water goes back into our capillaries. I have 2 links there on the page. If you don't remember what osmosis is, you can go to Khan Academy, which is a short video, or you could just read a little bit on Wikipedia. Both of those places are good to get information from regarding this subject. So albumin, the first one that we're talking about, osmotic pressure, that osmotic pressure there is really important. And you need to realize that when your blood, being mostly water, we need to have a certain concentration in the blood in order to have that osmotic pressure pull the extra water out of our inner cellular tissue. So the next slide here is a picture of what happens when that water does not go back into the capillaries to be recycled by the body. And these children suffer from water retention. Again, osmosis. Water is going to flow from areas of high concentration to low concentration. And if there aren't plasmas in the blood, then that water is not going to move back into the blood vessels. And this is the distension of the belly here that shows that these boys are lacking protein. So very, very important, these proteins that we have in our blood. So right here are the other 2 proteins that we have. We have globulin, which globulin is going to transport lipids. Remember, lipids are fats. And then we have fibrinogen. Now, fibrinogen is going to be really important. Please notice there that it's responsible for clotting. And we're going to talk more about clotting pretty extensively here in a minute. And then the last thing is the electrolytes that we're going to find in our cells. We also call these salts. You guys know that you need sodium and potassium for neurological function. So when you think sodium and potassium, super important. You do need to record this slide, but the next slide is really more for your information. So when we look at the electrolytes there, the medical or scientific term for salts, these are electrically charged ions. So remember that ions have an unequal number of electrons in relation to the protons, giving them an overall charge. So if you'll read that over. Okay, so your body fluids there, and sodium and chloride are the 2 that we've talked about. And then there's some other major ones that you need in your body, like magnesium and phosphate, potassium, calcium, bicarbonate, and sulfate as well. So as far as the nutrients go, the nutrients that we have in our plasma are going to be things like glucose, glucose of course being the fuel of our cells, amino acids being what proteins are made of, and then of course we have fats, the thing that we don't want too much of in our blood because those are going to clog our arteries, and then of course we all know we need vitamins. So those things are very, very important. Your blood's also going to take waste away. If you look at this image up here on the right, you'll see here that the amino acids come down and they make ammonia when those amino acids are processed. When your body breaks down proteins, ammonia is made. And ammonia is not something you want in your body. We usually use ammonia in cleaning products. And if there's urea in your body, which is a product coming from the bile, we can process that ammonia and we end up urinating it out. And if we don't have that urea, then our body builds up toxic levels of ammonia. So really important to have these particles in our blood to help us process the waste materials to get them out of our blood. Then we also have respiratory gases. CO2 and O2 are going to be in our blood. Obviously, we've talked about that pretty extensively. And then you're going to have enzymes and hormones as well. So, of course, hormones are going to be chemicals that send signals from glands to other parts, other organs in your body, and so forth. Okay, so we're going to take some time now to go back to the physiology of blood. And when we talk about hemostasis, that's going to be the idea that your blood needs to clot. So hemostasis is how we stop bleeding. And you'll notice here there's a picture of a cut and you have red blood cells leaving. And so we're going to need to have those platelets come along. Notice the purple platelets here. They're going to come along and they are going to clog up the opening where the red blood cells are escaping. And as they do that, you need something in your blood called fibrin. And that fibrin is going to act like a net. Those fibrin molecules are going to join together and they're going to hold the red blood cells in place, making a bandage. Your body is going to band-aid the end of any spot that's bleeding in order to stop that bleeding. Now, fibrin, being as important as it is, we don't normally find it in our body because you think about it, you don't want your blood to clot. So when your blood is flowing through your body, if we were to have a clot, that would be a serious health concern. So your body has a number of pathways that it goes through in order to try to make sure that your blood doesn't clot unless absolutely necessary. Okay? So some of these checkpoints, I'll call them. Some of them are inside of your blood. These chemical components are in your blood, and some of them are in the intercellular fluid and space around your blood vessels. So we call some intrinsic and some extrinsic. So intrinsic means inside, and extrinsic means outside. So intrinsic pathways, these are going to be particles that are inside your blood. And the platelets, as they disintegrate, they release something called thromboplastin. On the outside of our blood vessels, in that intercellular space, there are elements there that will release thromboplastin outside your blood vessels to help also stop blood from leaking out of injured tissue. So there are two pathways, intrinsic and extrinsic, but notice they both release thromboplastin. Now, thromboplastin is really important because it's going to take prothrombin and make thrombin. Very complicated. Don't worry too much about it. Just notice here in this diagram that we have an intrinsic pathway and we have an extrinsic pathway. And the whole idea here is to make sure that the blood doesn't clot unless it's supposed to. So the platelets cling and their surfaces provide sites for these molecules to attach to make this little net for them. And then there's all of these checkpoints. Do you really want your blood to clot? Yes, we want your blood to clot. Are you sure you want the blood to clot? Yes, we want the blood to clot. So these go back and forth, and these are called clotting factors. So people that have bleeding disorders often are missing a clotting factor, so their blood won't clot because the body says, are you sure you want to clot? And when they're missing a clotting factor, they're like, nope, not so sure. So the blood does not clot. But anyway, the whole point is right here, let's write this slide down for sure. Okay, so we have that prothrombin that's being released. And it's being turned into thrombin. Now, the reason why it has to be turned into something else is because we need something that's insoluble. So think about getting butter on your hands. You can't just rinse it off. You have to use soap in order to get it off. That would be insoluble. It doesn't dissolve in water. So if your blood's mostly water, when your blood goes to clot, it needs to be insoluble because otherwise your blood's liquid would just wash it away. So the fibrinogen that's produced needs to be changed by the thrombin into fibrin. Remember the idea of fibrosis. Remember the idea of scarring is fibrosis. Okay, fibrin, this says insoluble. Your body is going to be able to hold on to it. It is a substance that will allow you to stop bleeding, okay? So this fibrin is then going to be that mesh that traps the red blood cells and the platelets, and once it traps them all, it starts contracting. Those molecules all like basically become stronger and they start pulling, and then we get what we call retraction. And that's when you're going to end up with a nice tight scab that's going to go over the end of your clotting, so that way you stop bleeding. Okay, so that's what you need to know about plasma. I am going to remind you that the main part here in blood plasma is that your blood plasma has a couple major things that you need to remember. One is going to be those plasma proteins. Okay, so those plasma proteins were responsible for the osmotic pressure to make sure that the blood is actually going to return. The fluid is actually going to return back to the blood, so that way we don't end up with extra fluid in our bodies, which we don't want. And we're also going to have globulin to transport the fats around, and the fibrinogen in order to stop from bleeding. So finish up your notes, and next we're going to talk about blood type. So these notes are not finished for blood.